The encryption keys just vanished. My sister handed me a drink with a smile I didn't trust. Now I'm holding a flash drive that wasn't supposed to exist. And the DNA report inside just shattered my entire life. The gala roars in the next room. My father's toast starts in minutes. And I'm not his son. The attacker lunged from behind the curtains. I barely fended him off with a silver decanter. The drive in my hand isn't the bypass codes. It's proof I've been living a lie. The clock's ticking. The truth is out. And my family's about to implode. The cursor pulsed against the terminal's black void, a rhythmic heartbeat mocking David Sterling's frantic pace. Sweat slicked the mechanical keyboard, making his fingers slide across the home row. He struck the enter key. A red dialog box bloomed across the monitor. Access denied. Blue light carved deep hollows into David's face. The silence of the study tasted like ozone and stale coffee. He leaned into the screen, eyes tracing the cascading lines of the Sterling Trust's corrupted security. Somewhere in those strings of characters lay the family's survival. If the digital locks didn't reset before the London markets opened, the legacy dissolved into pixels. David's hand hovered over the numpad. His pulse thrummed in his fingertips, a dull ache matching the strobe of the server rack. 1, 2, 3, David whispered, his voice a dry rasp. He wasn't counting the lines of code. He was counting the seconds until the next failure. He needed to find the entry point, the small crack in the mountain of data where someone had reached in and turned the lights out. The Sterling Trust wasn't just a bank. It was a fortress built on secrets, and right now, the drawbridge was jammed. He adjusted his glasses by the bridge, a sharp, repetitive motion that felt like a tick. The heavy oak door groaned. Eleanor glided inside, the silk of her robe whispering against the floorboards. She carried a crystal tumbler, the ice clinking a jagged melody against the glass. The scent of expensive gin and juniper overrode the smell of hot circuitry. "You need to breathe, David." She set the drink on the edge of his desk, precisely over a pile of overdue notices. David didn't turn. His eyes remained locked on the scrolling screen. Eleanor's hand settled on his shoulder, her thumb pressing into the knotted muscle of his trapezius. The warmth of her palm seeped through his cotton shirt, an anchor dragging him away from the screen. "One sip," she murmured. "For your nerves." "Not now, Eleanor." David gripped the edge of the mahogany desk until his knuckles turned white. The solution was sliding away, buried under her gentle, suffocating weight. He could feel her watching him, her predatory eyes scanning the back of his neck. She wasn't here to comfort him. She was here to measure the depth of his panic. "Father is asking for the merger documents," Eleanor said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous silk. "The board is already in the ballroom. The champagne is pouring, David. It would be a shame if the guest of honor was found huddled over a dead machine." David ignored her, his fingers flying across the keys again. He was trying to bypass a wall that felt like 1,000 fists pounding on a door at once. Someone had flooded the system, a deliberate act of sabotage that smelled of an inside job. He could feel the heat radiating from the server tower beneath the desk, a low hum that vibrated through the soles of his shoes. "I'm almost through," David lied. He wasn't through. He was drowning. Eleanor leaned in, her face inches from his. "You've always been so good with the numbers, David. But numbers don't have blood. They don't have a pulse. You're trying to save a ghost." She straightened her lace gloves, a movement that made David's skin crawl. He knew that gesture. It meant she was hiding the raw, bleeding cuticles she picked at when she was plotting. The red glove rule. Someone was about to be destroyed, and as the monitor flashed another red warning, David realized it was likely him. The air in the study grew heavy, the scent of lavender from the hallway mixing with the metallic tang of the overheating computer. David felt the walls closing in. He needed to find the bypass. He needed to be the son Arthur Sterling expected him to be. 21, 22, he whispered, resetting his focus. He had to be perfect. If he miscounted, the world would fall apart. The shadows in the corner of the study seemed to detach themselves from the heavy velvet curtains. David didn't notice at first. He was too buried in the rhythmic clack of the keys and the blue-white strobe of the monitor. The silence of the room was thick, broken only by the distant, muffled roar of the gala in the ballroom. The clink of silverware, the high-pitched laughter of the Manhattan elite, and the low thrum of a string quartet playing something by Vivaldi. Then a floorboard groaned. It wasn't the soft whisper of Eleanor's silk robe. It was a heavy, deliberate weight. David froze. His fingers hovered over the home row. He didn't turn his head, but his eyes darted to the reflection in the dark glass of the window. A silhouette moved. A man, broad-shouldered and dressed in the tactical black of a high-end security contractor, stepped out from behind the drapes. The light from the server rack caught the dull glint of a weapon, not a gun, but something heavy and blunt. Before David could scream, the man lunged. The impact was a physical shock that knocked the air from David's lungs. He was thrown sideways, his glasses skittering across the mahogany floor. The world became a blur of motion and gray shadows. He felt a gloved hand grip his throat, the leather smelling of wood smoke and old sweat. Cold terror spiked in his chest, but beneath it, a primal instinct for survival took over. David reached out blindly, his hand sweeping across the desk. His fingers brushed against the heavy silver decanter Eleanor had left. He gripped the cold, ornate handle and swung with everything he had. The sound was a sickening thud. Metal meeting bone. The assailant grunted, his grip loosening just enough for David to twist away. David scrambled back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He didn't look for his glasses. He didn't look for an exit. He looked for the next strike. The contractor recovered quickly, his movements professional and efficient. He came at David again, a low growl vibrating in his chest. They collided near the sideboard. David felt the sharp edge of a crystal bowl bite into his lower back. He used his weight to shove the man toward the heavy oak cabinets. The struggle was silent and brutal. No cinematic dialogue, just the sound of tearing fabric and the wet slap of skin on skin. David felt a sharp pain in his shoulder as he was slammed against the wall. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. He drove his knee into the man's midsection and followed up with a desperate two-handed shove. The contractor's head hit the corner of the sideboard with a crack that sounded like a dry branch snapping. He slumped to the floor, his eyes rolling back, the fight draining out of him in an instant. David stood over him, chest heaving, his tuxedo jacket torn at the seam. His heart was a drum in his ears, a frantic, uneven rhythm. He looked down at his hands. They were shaking. The silver decanter lay on the rug, a dent in its side, a smear of dark red staining the polished surface. He had won. For the first time in his life, David Sterling hadn't used a code or a contract to solve a problem. He had used his hands. A strange, cold clarity washed over him. He reached down, his fingers trembling as he searched the unconscious man's tactical vest. Subverted. David's fingers brushed against something hard and rectangular in the man's pocket. He pulled it out. A sleek, black flash drive with a gold-plated connector. Relief hit him like a physical wave, so strong it made his knees weak. This had to be it. The security contractor wasn't just an assassin. He was the carrier. In the world of high-stakes corporate espionage, you didn't just delete data. You held it hostage on a physical key. This drive would have the bypass codes. It would have the master key to the Sterling Trust. "I have it," David breathed, the words a jagged prayer. "I can fix this." He scrambled back to the desk, ignoring the stinging cut on his cheek and the dull ache in his ribs. He felt brilliant. He felt like the hero of his own story. He had defended his home, neutralized a threat, and secured the prize. Arthur would have to look at him now. Arthur would have to admit that David was more than just a calculator in a suit. He was a Sterling. He was a survivor. He jammed the drive into the side of his laptop. The system chirped, a high, hopeful sound. A progress bar appeared on the screen, filling rapidly. Reading, device. Accessing files. David leaned in, his face inches from the glass. He could almost taste the victory. It tasted like ozone and success. He imagined the look on Eleanor's face when he walked into the ballroom with the merger documents fully restored. He imagined the slight, rare nod of approval from his father. This was the moment everything changed. This was the moment he became untouchable. The progress bar hit 100%. A single folder appeared on the desktop, labeled with a string of dates and a laboratory serial number. David frowned. That didn't look like a security protocol. He clicked the folder. Inside was a single PDF document. He opened it, his heart still racing with the remnants of the fight. The document wasn't a list of codes. It wasn't a bypass for the encryption. It was a forensic DNA report from a private lab in New Jersey. David's eyes scanned the page, skipping past the technical jargon until they hit the summary at the bottom. The words seemed to vibrate on the screen, blurring and then sharpening into a jagged, impossible truth. Subject: David Sterling. Paternal match: 0.00%. The world tilted. The air in the study suddenly felt freezing, as if the blizzard outside had smashed through the windows. David's breath hitched in his throat. He read the line again and again. 0.00%. No biological relation to Arthur Sterling. The realization didn't come all at once. It arrived in shards. The man he had just fought wasn't a killer hired to stop the merger. He was a process server. The weapon in his hand hadn't been a club. It was a legal satchel. Eleanor hadn't sent a hitman. She had sent a messenger. David looked down at the unconscious man on the floor. He wasn't a shadow or a monster. He was just a guy doing a job, and David had nearly killed him to protect a lie he hadn't even known he was living. By plugging in that drive, David hadn't saved the Sterling Trust. He had officially opened the evidence that ended his life. The system hadn't just read the drive, it had logged the access. Somewhere, on a server he no longer controlled, a notification had just been sent. The secret was out. The encryption crisis had been a lure, a distraction to get him to grab the one thing that could destroy him. He wasn't a Sterling. He was a ghost in a stolen house. The heavy oak door didn't just open this time. It was thrown wide, the hinges screaming a protest that echoed through the vaulted ceiling of the study. Arthur Sterling stood in the threshold. He looked like a statue carved from winter, cold, unyielding, and ancient. His white shirt was blindingly bright against the dark wood of the doorframe, the collar stiff and perfect, a sharp contrast to David's disheveled tuxedo and blood-streaked face. Behind him, the gala continued to roar, a distant sea of voices that felt miles away. Arthur didn't look at the unconscious man on the rug. He didn't look at the dented silver decanter. His gaze fixed on David, his eyes like two chips of flint. "The board is waiting, David," Arthur said. His voice was a low, tectonic grind. "I am told the documents are not ready. I am told there is a technical difficulty." David tried to stand, but his legs felt like they were made of water. He reached out to close the laptop, his movements frantic and clumsy. "Father, There was an intruder. I had to defend the office. I was just about to." His hand swiped across the desk, catching the edge of a vintage porcelain vase. It was a Ming Dynasty piece, a delicate thing of blue and white that had sat on that desk for 30 years. It tumbled. In David's mind, the world slowed down. He watched the vase fall, expecting the crash, the sharp explosion of ceramic on hardwood. But as it hit the floor, there was only a dull, hollow thud. The sound was swallowed by the room, as if the very air had turned to velvet. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any scream. It felt like the house itself had stopped breathing, waiting for the sentence to be passed. Arthur's eyes dropped to the shattered pieces of the heirloom. He didn't flinch. He didn't show anger. He simply stared at the ruin with a profound, weary disappointment. "That vase survived 3 wars and 5 moves," Arthur murmured. "It could not survive one night of your incompetence." "It wasn't incompetence." David's voice cracked. He pointed at the screen, the DNA report still glowing like a radioactive wound. "Eleanor. She set this up. She's trying to steal the trust. This report, it's a forgery. It has to be." "Is it?" Eleanor stepped out from behind Arthur, her face a mask of tragic concern that didn't reach her predatory eyes. She held a glass of water in one hand and a second notarized copy of the DNA report in the other. She looked at the guests who had begun to cluster in the hallway, their faces pale and curious. "David, please," Eleanor said, her voice loud enough to carry into the hall. "We all wanted to believe the lie. But the science doesn't lie. You've been occupying a seat that doesn't belong to you. You've been spending money that isn't yours." She turned to the board members, her expression shifting to one of righteous authority. "Members of the board, I regret to inform you that the merger cannot proceed under the current leadership. David Sterling is not a legal heir. He is a genetic fraud." A gasp rippled through the crowd. The sound was like a physical blow to David's chest. He looked at the faces of the men he had worked with for a decade, the people who had toasted his brilliance just an hour ago. Now, they looked at him with a mixture of pity and disgust, as if he were a smudge on a window they were finally cleaning. "I am a Sterling," David shouted, his voice echoing off the library walls. "I built the security protocols. I managed the offshore accounts. I am the one who kept this family afloat while you were picking at your fingers in the dark, Eleanor." Arthur didn't look at Eleanor. He didn't look at the board. He looked at David as if he were a bug under glass. "A Sterling does not shout," Arthur said softly. "A Sterling does not break things. And a Sterling is born, not made." He raised a hand, a small, subtle gesture. From the shadows of the hallway, Thomas Wright and 2 other security guards stepped forward. They didn't look like protectors anymore. They looked like jailers. Thomas adjusted his tie exactly 3 times. Click, click, click. "Take him to the library," Arthur commanded. "Lock the doors. I will deal with the legalities once the guests have departed. And David, do not touch anything else. You have destroyed enough for one lifetime." The guards moved in. David felt the heavy grip of Thomas Wright on his arm, a hand like a vice, cold and mechanical. He was pulled from the desk, his feet dragging across the hardwood. He looked back at the laptop, the blue light of the DNA report still pulsing. A digital tombstone for the man he used to be. The library was a canyon of leather and paper, a place that usually smelled of old wisdom and expensive tobacco. Tonight, it felt like a tomb. The floor-to-ceiling bookshelves seemed to lean inward, the thousands of volumes absorbing the heat and light, until the room felt unnervingly cold. Thomas Wright stood by the heavy mahogany doors, his back to the exit, his posture as rigid as a stone pillar. The other two guards stood by the windows, watching the snow lash against the glass. The blizzard had arrived in earnest now. The wind howled through the eaves, a high, mournful sound that vibrated in the floorboards. David sat in a high-backed velvet chair, his hands tucked between his knees to hide their shaking. He felt small. For 32 years, he had been the prince of this estate. Now, he was a trespasser. "Thomas," David said, his voice barely a whisper. "You've known me since I was 10. You taught me how to fly a drone in the back meadow. You know this is a mistake." Thomas didn't look at him. He stared at a point exactly 6 inches above David's head. "I have my orders, sir. Please remain seated." "Orders? From a man who just found out I'm not his blood? Does that change 10 years of service? Does that change the fact that I'm the one who authorized your pension increase last spring?" Thomas's jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. The loyalty in this house wasn't built on kindness. It was built on the numbering system of Arthur Sterling's white shirts. It was a machine, and David had been unplugged. David's gaze drifted to the fireplace. A low fire was struggling against the draft, the flames licking at a damp log. Beside the hearth sat a heavy brass fireplace poker, polished to a mirror shine. It was a beautiful, lethal thing. He looked at the guards. They were distracted, watching the driveway as a set of headlights cut through the whiteout. Eleanor's legal team. Sarah Thompson would be in that car, her briefcase full of sugar packets and restraining orders. Once she walked through those doors, David's life would be legally dismantled. He had maybe 5 minutes. He didn't think. If he thought, he would count the steps, and if he counted the steps, he would realize the odds were against him. David lunged. He didn't go for the door. He went for the poker. His fingers closed around the cold, heavy brass, and he swung it in a wide arc before Thomas could even blink. The heavy end of the poker caught the nearest guard in the thigh, a bone-jarring impact that sent the man crumpling to the floor with a cry of pain. "Sir, stop!" Thomas shouted, his hand flying to his belt. David didn't stop. He felt a surge of adrenaline that tasted like copper. He swung again, forcing Thomas back. He wasn't a fighter, but he was fast, and he was desperate. He used the poker like a lever, shoving a heavy rolling ladder into Thomas's path. The ladder groaned, its wheels shrieking on the floor, creating a temporary barrier of wood and brass. David bolted for the side service door, a small, inconspicuous entrance hidden behind a tapestry. He knew this house better than any of them. He knew the shortcuts, the blind spots, the places where the shadows were deep enough to hide a man who didn't exist. He burst into the hallway, the cold air from the service corridor hitting him like a physical blow. He ran, his dress shoes slipping on the polished stone. 1, 2, 3, he gasped, his lungs burning. He reached the heavy steel door that led to the garage. He could hear the heavy boots of the security team behind him, the rhythmic thud of their pursuit echoing off the walls. He slammed his shoulder into the door, bursting into the subterranean chill of the garage. His Tesla sat in its charging bay, a sleek, white shark in the gloom. It was the only thing in this world that still responded to his touch. He fumbled for the key fob in his pocket, his thumb pressing the unlock button. The car chirped, its flush door handles popping out like an invitation. David scrambled inside, slamming the door and hitting the start button. The dashboard glowed to life, a familiar sanctuary of screens and data. "Come on," he hissed. He put the car in reverse, his eyes locked on the rearview camera. He could see Thomas Wright emerging from the doorway, his face grim, his hand raised. David floored it. The electric motors whined, a high-pitched scream of power as the car lurched backward, tires screeching on the concrete. Subverted. David swung the wheel, aiming for the main garage door. His heart was hammering against his ribs, a frantic, triumphant beat. He was going to make it. He would get to the city, find a lawyer who wasn't on the Sterling payroll, and fight this. He had his own accounts, his own secrets. He wasn't dead yet. He pressed the remote for the garage door. Nothing happened. He pressed it again, harder. The heavy steel door remained shut, a wall of cold gray. "Open, you piece of—" Suddenly, the car's main screen flickered. The navigation map vanished, replaced by a spinning red icon. A chime sounded, not the friendly greeting of the car, but a harsh, mechanical sequence of tones. "Remote override active," the screen flashed. "System lockdown." The steering wheel jerked under David's hands, then went limp. He pulled at it, but it spun freely, disconnected from the wheels. The brake pedal pushed back against his foot, hardening until it was like treading on solid rock. "No," David whispered. "No." The door locks clicked, a sharp, final sound that echoed in the small cabin. He pulled the handle. It didn't budge. He tried the emergency manual release, but it felt jammed, as if a physical bolt had been slid into place from the outside. A familiar voice crackled over the car's high-end speakers. It wasn't the smooth AI assistant. It was Eleanor. "Did you really think I'd leave the fleet management protocols in your hands, David?" Her voice purred, sounding horribly intimate in the cramped space. "You're so focused on the big encryption, you forget the small locks. The car belongs to the trust. The garage belongs to the trust. And since 10 minutes ago, the trust has decided you are a liability." David hammered his fists against the reinforced glass. "Eleanor, let me out. This is kidnapping." "It's repossession," she corrected. "I've already filed the paperwork." The blood descent clause was triggered the moment the DNA report was verified by the board's counsel. "You aren't being kidnapped, David. You're being evicted from a vehicle you no longer have the legal right to occupy." Through the windshield, David saw Thomas Wright walk calmly toward the car. He wasn't running anymore. He didn't need to. He stood in front of the hood, looking at David through the glass with a look of hollow pity. "The police are on their way, David," Eleanor's voice continued. "Sarah is serving the restraining order as we speak. If you stay in the car, you're trespassing. If you break the window, it's destruction of corporate property. Either way, you're done." The screen faded to black, leaving David in total darkness. The heater died. The quiet hum of the electronics vanished. In the sudden silence, he could hear the wind howling outside the garage doors and the ticking of his own watch, a rhythmic, mocking sound that told him he was out of time. He was trapped in a $100,000 coffin, surrounded by the empire he had built, and he couldn't even open the door. The air inside the car grew stale and cold with terrifying speed. David felt the walls of the Tesla pressing in on him, the leather seats smelling of new car and impending ruin. He looked at the heavy fireplace poker he had dropped on the passenger floor mat. It was his only tool left. He didn't hesitate. He gripped the brass handle and swung the heavy end into the side window. The sound was an explosion of glass, a sharp, crystalline shatter that filled the cabin with diamond-like shards. The cold Connecticut air rushed in, smelling of pine and exhaust. David scrambled through the broken frame, the jagged edges of the safety glass slicing into his tuxedo sleeves. But he didn't feel the pain. He hit the concrete floor of the garage, rolling and coming up in a crouch. Thomas Wright was already moving toward him, but David was faster. He didn't head for the main house. He bolted for the small side door that led to the estate grounds. He burst outside, and the world disappeared. The blizzard was a wall of white. The wind screamed, a physical force that nearly knocked him off his feet. He couldn't see the driveway. He couldn't see the tree line. He could only see the swirling, chaotic dance of the snow. "David Sterling!" A voice boomed through the storm. He turned to see a flash of blue and red lights cutting through the haze. A police cruiser was crawling up the driveway, followed by a black SUV. Sarah Thompson's car. He didn't wait for them to reach him. He turned and ran into the darkness of the north lawn. His dress shoes sank into the deep drifts, the freezing slush soaking through his socks. Within seconds, his feet were numb, his toes feeling like heavy stones. He wrapped his arms around his chest, his breath coming in the white plumes that were instantly whipped away by the gale. He needed cover. He needed a place where the infrared sensors wouldn't pick him up. He remembered the old carriage house. It was a relic from the 19th century, tucked away behind a grove of ancient oaks. Arthur had never bothered to upgrade the security there because there was nothing in it but dust and broken garden furniture. David stumbled through the trees, the branches clawing at his face like skeletal fingers. He saw the dark outline of the carriage house, a shadow against the white. He lunged for the door, his frozen fingers fumbling with a heavy iron latch. It groaned, resisting, then gave way. Inside, the air was still, smelling of dry hay and rot. David collapsed against the door, sliding down to the floor. He was shivering so violently, his teeth clicked together. 1, 2, 3, he whispered, trying to find his center. 4, 5. I'm still here. I'm still David. But who was David? If he wasn't a Sterling, he was a vacuum. He was a man with no history. His hand brushed against a loose floorboard near the corner. It was a small thing, a piece of wood that sat slightly higher than the others. He remembered his mother, Margaret, sitting in this very spot when he was a child. She used to come here to listen to the birds, she'd said. But the carriage house was always silent. He reached out and pulled at the board. It came up with a dry creak. Tucked into the joists below was a small, leather-bound volume. The cover was worn, the edges frayed. David pulled it out, his heart leaping. He knew that handwriting. It was elegant, slanted, and full of apologies. Margaret's diary. He opened it to a random page, his eyes straining to read in the dim light, filtering through the cracks in the walls. October 14th. Arthur knows, the entry began. He has known since the day David was born. He looked at the boy's eyes and saw a stranger. He didn't scream. He didn't cast us out. He smiled. He told me that a secret is more valuable than a son. He said he would keep the boy, but only as a temporary asset. I am so sorry, David. I am so sorry for the life I have given you. Asterisk. David felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the blizzard. Arthur hadn't been surprised by the DNA report. He hadn't been betrayed by Eleanor tonight. He had been holding this card for 32 years. He had watched David grow, watched him strive for approval, watched him break his back to prove his worth, all while knowing he was a temporary asset. The encryption crisis, The security breach, the DNA leak. It wasn't a coup by Eleanor. It was a scheduled liquidation. Arthur was cleaning his books. A sudden, fierce heat flared in David's chest. It wasn't the warmth of a fire. It was the white-hot burn of a man who had finally seen the monster in the light. He stood up, his movements no longer frantic. He tucked the diary into his waistband. He didn't care about the police. He didn't care about the restraining order. He had spent his life being a ghost in Arthur's machine. It was time to haunt the operator. He stepped back out into the storm. He knew the perimeter. He knew where the infrared sensors had blind spots, the places where the old stone walls interfered with the heat signatures. He moved like a shadow, counting the paces between the pulses of the security lights. 10, 11, 12. He reached the back terrace of the main house. The gala was over. The lights in the ballroom were dimmed, but the study was still glowing with a cold, predatory blue. He climbed the trellis, the frozen wood groaning under his weight. He reached the second-floor balcony and slipped through the unlocked French doors, the ones he had purposefully left unlatched 3 days ago because of a feeling he couldn't explain. The hallway was silent, smelling of floor wax and expensive citrus. He made his way to the study, his footsteps muffled by the thick Persian rugs. He could hear voices inside. Arthur and Eleanor. David pushed the door open. It didn't groan this time. It glided on its hinges, a silent intruder in a room full of lies. Arthur was sitting behind his desk, his white shirt as perfect as it had been 6 hours ago. Eleanor stood beside him, her lace gloves discarded on the mahogany surface, her fingers raw and red as she picked at her cuticles. "You should have stayed in the car, David," Arthur said, not looking up from a ledger. "It would have been much cleaner for the lawyers." "The lawyers don't have this," David said, his voice steady. He held up the diary. Arthur finally looked up. For a split second, the granite mask slipped. His eyes widened, a flicker of something that might have been fear, or perhaps just the annoyance of a man seeing a ghost he thought he'd buried. "That belongs to the estate," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "It belongs to my mother," David countered. "And it says you knew. You knew for 30 years. You didn't keep me out of love or even out of pity. You kept me as a tool, a temporary asset." "Well, the asset just matured, Arthur." David stepped forward, the diary clutched in his hand. "I'm going to the press. I'm going to the board. I'm going to tell them that the great Arthur Sterling built his empire on a foundation of fraud and psychological torture. I'll burn the Sterling name to the ground before I let you hand it to Eleanor." Eleanor lunged. She didn't use a weapon. She used her nails, her face contorted into a mask of pure, feral rage. "You're nothing. You're a mistake. Give it to me." David caught her wrists, and then Arthur was up, moving with a speed that defied his age. The three of them collided in the center of the room, a desperate, silent wrestling match for the leather-bound book. Arthur's hands were like iron. He gripped David's throat, his thumbs pressing into the windpipe. David felt the world start to gray at the edges. He swung his elbow, catching Arthur in the ribs, but the old man didn't let go. He was fighting for his legacy, for the secret that kept his world upright. "You are nothing," Arthur hissed, his face inches from David's. With a final, violent heave, Arthur shoved David back. David's head hit the edge of the server rack, a sharp, metallic clang that sent stars dancing across his vision. He slumped to the floor, the diary falling from his limp fingers. Arthur stood over him, chest heaving, his perfect white shirt finely wrinkled. He picked up the diary, his eyes cold and triumphant. You were always so focused on the logic, David, Arthur panted. But you forgot the most basic rule of the hunt. The lion doesn't care if the cub is his. He only cares if the cub can kill. He looked at Eleanor, who was leaning against the desk, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She has the instinct, Arthur said, his voice returning to its tectonic calm. She knew when to strike. She knew how to bait the trap. You? You spent 30 years counting the stairs instead of looking at who was standing at the top. Arthur turned to the fireplace and tossed the diary into the flames. David watched, paralyzed, as the leather scorched and the pages curled. His mother's apologies turning to ash in seconds. "Thomas!" Arthur shouted. The door opened. Thomas Wright stepped in, followed by 2 guards. "The test is over," Arthur said, not looking at David. "The successor has been chosen. Take this, stranger, off my property. Dump him at the gate. If he ever sets foot on Sterling land again, treat him as a common thief." David felt the heavy hands of the guards under his armpits. He didn't fight them. He didn't have anything left to fight with. He looked at Eleanor. She was smiling, a sharp, predatory expression that finally reached her eyes. "Goodbye, David," she whispered. "I'll be sure to send your things to a shelter." They dragged him out of the study, down the grand staircase, 1, 2, 3, and through the foyer. They opened the massive front doors, and the blizzard rushed in, a cold, indifferent welcome. They tossed him into the snow. David hit the ground, the freezing white powder filling his mouth and eyes. He heard the heavy thud of the oak doors closing. He heard the metallic clack of the deadbolt. He was alone. He was penniless. He was no one. The cold was absolute. It didn't just bite. It consumed. David lay in the snow for what felt like hours, watching the orange glow of the fire pit in the courtyard. The guards were there, silhouettes against the flame, tossing the last remnants of his mother's diary into the heat. He could hear the paper crackling, a small, final sound that signaled the end of his history. High above, on the stone balcony, Arthur Sterling stood like a king overlooking a battlefield. He didn't look down at the man shivering in the drifts. He looked out at the storm, his posture rigid and perfect. David tried to move his fingers. They felt like dry twigs. He managed to push himself up, his tuxedo jacket frozen stiff, his skin a pale, ghostly blue. He looked at the massive iron gates of the estate. They were locked, the heavy chains rattling in the wind. He was dead to them, a temporary asset that had been fully depreciated. He began to walk. He didn't have a destination, but he couldn't stay here. If he stayed, the snow would become his shroud. He moved toward the gatehouse, a small stone structure near the perimeter. It was empty, the heater long since broken, but it offered a momentary shield from the wind. He collapsed inside, his back against the cold stone wall. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in his life, he didn't count, he didn't measure the risk. He just felt. He felt the silence. He felt the weight of the Sterling name falling away from him. It was a strange, terrifying lightness. For 32 years, he had been a prisoner of a legacy that wasn't even his. He had lived in a house of glass, terrified of the first stone. Now, the glass was shattered, and he was still breathing. "I'm not a Sterling," he whispered. The words felt like a key turning in a lock. "I'm not a Sterling." A small, jagged laugh escaped his throat. If he wasn't a Sterling, then the rules didn't apply. The non-compete clauses he had signed, void. The loyalty oaths, meaningless. The blood descent clause that Eleanor had used to strip his assets. It was a double-edged sword. His hand went to his inner pocket. His fingers brushed against something small and hard. A handheld device. Not a phone. Arthur had taken that. It was a dedicated hardware key, a small, unassuming plastic fob he had built himself years ago. He called it the ghost key. He had funneled ghost dividends, redundant pennies from 1,000 different transactions, into a hidden offshore account for years. He'd told himself it was a security measure for the trust, a rainy day fund for the family. But deep down, he knew. He had been building a lifeboat. He pressed the small button on the side of the fob. A tiny OLED screen flickered to life. Authenticating? David leaned his head back against the stone. He didn't need the Sterling Trust. He was the one who had built the encryption. He was the one who knew where the back doors were hidden. He knew the routing numbers of the shell companies in the Caymans. He knew the passwords to the private servers in Zurich. By proving he wasn't a Sterling, Eleanor had legally severed his connection to the company. But she had also severed the company's claim on him. In the eyes of the law, he was a third-party contractor who had been wrongfully terminated. The screen on the fob turned green. Balance: $42 million. David stared at the numbers. It wasn't the billions of the Sterling Trust, but it was enough. It was more than enough to buy a new name. It was enough to build a new fortress. He stood up, his limbs still heavy with cold, but his mind sharp and clear. He looked back at the mansion. The lights were flickering. The storm was winning. He realized something then. Something Arthur and Eleanor had missed in their greed. The merger contracts. He had written them himself. Section 4.2. The validity of this agreement is contingent upon the notarized signature of the eldest male heir of the Sterling bloodline. Arthur had just gone on record, in front of the board and the police, stating that David was not a blood heir. Without David's signature, the merger was a house of cards. The billions that Eleanor coveted, the legacy Arthur was trying to protect, it was all legally void. The moment David walked out those gates, the Sterling Trust would begin to hemorrhage value. The board would sue. The partners would flee. Arthur had traded his son for a lie, and in doing so, he had signed his own death warrant. David pushed open the door of the gatehouse. The wind was still howling, but it didn't feel as cold anymore. He walked toward the main road, his footsteps steady in the snow. He reached the edge of the property and looked back one last time. The Sterling estate looked like a tomb, a grand, empty monument to a man who loved stone more than people. Inside, he knew Eleanor would be celebrating. She would be pouring the expensive gin, picking at her fingers, dreaming of the throne. And Arthur would be sitting in his study, straightening the pens on his desk, thinking he had finally achieved perfection. They would realize it in the morning. When the banks opened, when the lawyers read the fine print, they would realize they had inherited a kingdom of worthless paper. David turned away and began to walk into the night. He didn't count the steps. He didn't look back. He just walked. A man with no name, no father, and a future he finally owned. The blizzard swallowed him whole. But for the first time in his life, David Sterling wasn't afraid of the dark. He was the one who knew how to turn the lights back on.